Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Deku went back in time and met younger Mirko, and fell in love with her, part 3. So before we start, go check out the author of this fanfic, Darth Erebus, link is in the description, also subscribe to our channel, and like this video, so let's begin the video. Izuku figured he was a pretty patient guy. Like, come on, he was running around playing pro hero for free, in one of, if not the worst city in Japan. The only place that topped Hada in terms of violent crime was the larger scale version of the town which sat to the north, Narshada. He'd been dealing with the worst of the worst when it came to cases without so much as a single real complaint. Someone had to deal with them after all, and Izuku just ended up becoming that guy. He understood, he really did. However, if there was one thing he guarded like a rabid hound and reacted with that same level of viciousness, if it was encroached on too much, it was the few, and really, it was only a few hours of sleep he was able to get in the early morning. Which is why when the dark-haired hero had finally gotten home, peeled off his gear, and collapsed onto the little cloister of pillows that he'd collected to form a makeshift bed in the corner of the living room, he'd been so happy. And then his phone buzzed. Not just once, because if it had been a message he could have ignored it, but it wasn't a message. The constant ringing pattern of the terrible buzzing noise promised him that. Healing himself up from his face-down position on top of his sleeping space, Izuku grabbed the phone which he'd plugged in only moments ago and squinted angrily at the beady blue light which seared his retina. Brag enthusiast. Pushing the phone to his ear, he answered. "Hello. Hiroichi. What is it?" he asked, and he knew his exhaustion was breeding an unwanted venom in his words. Over the course of the last month, Izuku had grown to understand how much the old man really did care for Hada and all the people in it. He, like Izuku, just couldn't go about helping and fixing things while standing on the firm light side of the law. He was also just a born and bred yakuza, so. Izuku. I'm sorry for waking you, the genuine regret that laced his words cooled the teen's tired anger, if only for a moment. But we just caught wind of a big deal going down at that old abandoned steel mill on the corner of Mazarin and Boba. It's the hard stuff, and a lot of it. You know the place. The old man yawned, and Izuku realized that he probably didn't get a lot of sleep either. He felt a kindred spirit for the mafia boss sprout in his chest. Yeah. Rubbing at his eyes, as a tired resignation grew in his heart, he nodded to no one. I'll hop on over and chat with the foreigners. Yeah, just give me the same talk Kakin used to give me except more violent. Thus, his patience bent and his sleep encroaching on, the rabid dog appeared. Thank you Izuku, please don't forget to let me know if you need anything, okay? The young hero swore that the old man treated him like his grandchild. If, you know, grandparents sent their grandchildren to deal with incredibly dangerous opponents and situations in exchange for information and support. I will, Hiroichi. Take care. Good night. Good night Izuku. Groaning, the overworked hero pulled himself from the sweet embrace of his pillows and moved towards the door. Splashing some cold water on his face, he got dressed for the second time that night in the green suit that was getting just a bit too small for comfort, if you knew what he meant. His support gear was also getting a bit tight, though his gloves still fit well, his iron soles were becoming painful to keep on for too long. Like that time that then one had gone skiing and he'd been forced to wear those foot murders they called ski boots. Like that. After getting dressed, he was unlocking the door when he heard some shifting from the pull-out. Still mostly asleep and with her ears drooping to the sides, Roomy pushed herself off her bed and stared at him with an exhausted half-awake look that sent a message Izuku didn't need words to understand. I just got a call from Hiroichi. Something big is going down with that dangerous enhancing drug from China I was telling you about. Izuku kept his voice quiet so as to not wake those in the other room. I'll be back. Be careful, Izuku. I will. And then, with that affirmation, she fell back to her pillows, claimed by the Sandman once again. Moving out, Deku felt a less than kin smile find its way to his face. Time to blow off some steam. Aoi knew that deals like this were always dangerous. From the legitimacy of the actual product itself to the people who were making the trade and the potential of being discovered by the local authorities, or even worse, pro-heroes. There were so many things that could go wrong with this sort of drop-off, which is why the location had been kept secret until the last second. Hada. Aoi knew the town had a bad terrible rep for being the scummiest place in Japan, bar Narshada, and that it was a shadow town ruled by the underground at night, so really she should have been set at ease, if only a little. The place was crawling with careers, so they didn't have to worry about heroes. Well, that would have been the case if it had been a couple months ago. The phantom hero, we were warned about him before coming here. There were only whispers, really, but they were enough. Talk of a powerful man who watched over the shadows of the hell city that was Hada and who seemed to always know when something was going down. He didn't have any official name, because officially, it seemed like he didn't exist, but he'd been given a name by those same shadowy figures who spread inconsistent stories about him under the flickering lights of run-down bars when they drank enough liquor that really, and all credibility fell away anyhow, because they were too scared to talk otherwise. She shivered. Eyes like him freaked her out, almost more than All Might. At least with All Might you knew what you were getting, but the whispers said that the Phantom was a beast of a man. A monster who had no mercy and would hunt you to the end of the earth. Of course, it's probably all just rumors after all. If he really was that strong, he'd have made some kind of debut by now. Honestly, I bet he's just a myth. At most he's some freak in a jumpsuit who's trying to play hero. Yeah. That's it. Nothing scary about him. That's what she told herself, at least, but the water user made sure to keep her eyes on the shadows a bit more than normal. She told herself she did it because Huda was shady, and she needed to keep her guard up, not because she was looking out for some definitely fake hero. Do you have what we agreed on? The man who was one ugly fucker, Aoi could tell you that much. Poor bastard looked like the unholy child of Davy Jones, and Squidward asked, and the blue-haired woman nodded. Of course. And the trigger? Squid Brain nodded, gesturing for one of his lackeys to haul a little crate forward from behind him. Moving away so the hydrokinetic could approach without fear of attack, Aoi inspected the merchandise, smiling maliciously. Now this is what I'm talking about. Oh, is that the hard stuff from China I've heard so much about? A voice called out to them from above, and both groups had weapons drawn and quirks brought to bear before he could finish speaking, searching the rafters for a man they couldn't find, as fear and adrenaline flooded their blood. Heart pounding in her ears, Aoi tried to calm herself down. What did you call it? Trigger. The voice asked again, and still, no one could see him. There's no way, there's no way, there's no way. Flourishing her arms forward, the water she carried at her hip was brought to bear, swirling around her with the movements of her limbs. He's not real. Everyone knows that there's no real heroes in Huda. Everyone knows that. Iridian eyes glowed in the shadows of the steel mill, arcs of powerful emerald energy crackling in the air as they snapped and flickered around the hidden figure, illuminating the hero in a way that was fitting, given his moniker as the Phantom, because it was only enough for them to make out the vaguest of outlines and the metal mask that stretched across his face. Not that seeing him mattered all that much, because they didn't need to see him to feel him. At the first hint of the emerald glow, Aoi felt something press down upon her, reaching deep inside and drowning her as she fought to stay standing. She wanted to call the presence unholy, but she knew that was wrong. This was not a power born of darkness, nor one that brought on respect through fear or the threat of suffering. This was a presence of one who was above and acted in authority, in judgment. Something that was, in a way, much more terrifying. It did not act in maliciousness, but under a divine ascendancy that cast down on them from heaven and existed on the simple truth that it could not be stopped because it was correct and they were in the wrong. This was a presence that Aoi knew her knees collapsed under, not from fear, but from the knowledge that they were unworthy to stand before the being whose energy was cascading over them. Memories came unbidden from the depths of the villain's mind, overcoming her as her arms dropped to her side like those of a string-cut puppet and the man beside her collapsed to the ground. The words of some old priest echoed in her ears as he described the angels that the people from the Bible would see from time to time. Beings whose skin was like fire and bronze and whose faces were like lightning and stars given shape. Creatures who turned cities to salt and brought down an unending fire upon the earth. The wrath of God. She didn't mean to think about these things, but she imagined that the people who'd seen such creatures had felt much like she did now. What is this guy? The air was thick, vibrating as the lightning sang, and the Viridian eyes promised nothing short of the judgment his power prophesied. She never even saw what hit her. Yeah, they're here. I'll stick around until you guys show up, but no later. I need to sleep too. Izuku sighed, rubbing tiredly at his eyes as he glanced over at the pile of drug runners and villains he'd captured. Maybe I went a little too far. None of them are conscious. Checking the time, he felt his eye twitch. On second thought, I was gentle enough. Didn't have anything to tie them up with anyway, so it was just a logical course of action. Shivering at the thought, which was incredibly similar to something he felt Mr. Izawa might say, he watched the stars as he waited for whoever was working the night shift to show up. As much as he wanted to just leave the villains for the police and go on his way get some much needed shut-eye, protocol dictated he at least stay until they were all detained properly and with quirk-suppressing cuffs. At the moment, the only thing keeping all of them from getting away besides the fact that they were currently in dreamland via some well-placed kicks was the fake pro, and he wouldn't be able to forgive himself if his selfishness led to them escaping. The cold in his chest became sharper in his exhaustion, however, and he wasn't proud to admit that he was a bit more rough with a group of criminals than he needed to be. He could have quite easily moved them more gently, but instead he just kinda plopped them down outside. Dropping them on the curb like some old trash, Izuku sat next to the pile of what do you even call a group of villains, at MURDER, lawbreakers, and began tiredly scrolling through his phone. After sending Orochi a text to tell him he was okay because he knew the old man was probably still awake and waiting for just such a text before he hit the hay himself, and that he might have something he'd need help with, soon his suit was hugging too tight in places he definitely didn't need it to hug. He found himself staring absent-mindedly at Roomy's contact. The simple Roomy Isajiyama was followed by a white rabbit emoji and made the young hero's heartbeat a little faster. Both at the thought of what had happened the previous morning and at the conversation that he knew he'd been avoiding. Roomy was no AM, but she'd been right to call him out for thinking she was an idiot. AM had come to the conclusion that something was up with his quirk because she was AM, Lord forbid she ever meet Nezu. Izuku could hear the terrified screams of UA students now, and she was a genius. She knew how to pick up on the subtleties of truths and half-truths and just didn't have the tact to keep her findings a secret. Roomy, however, knew him. She'd become the only member of Izuku's support network during a time that very well may be the most stressful of his life, and it showed. As long as he felt like he could share something with her, the young hero did. She'd gotten his full life story minus proper nouns and laced with the vagueness that the situation he was in demanded, but his life story all the same. From his anguish at being quirkless to the friend-turned-tormentor and the absentee father who sent money and nothing more. His feelings over living through all of that and the sorrow of watching as one by one, those quirkless classmates he'd grown up with were picked off by the cruel world around them, whether through suicide or some accident. He remembered one girl who'd had deep purple hair and sparkling blue eyes and was thought to have suicide, only for it to be revealed that she'd been murdered by her own mother. Strangled in her sleep and then hung to cover the killer's tracks. The only reason she'd been caught was because of the testimony of the girl's little brother, who'd been forced to listen to the struggling sounds of his dying sibling, her cries for mercy from the other room, and wanted retribution. So yeah, she knew him. So she also understood that when he got vague on certain things, it was only because it was necessary. She knew the tone, the body language, and eyes of an Izuku who was not hiding something out of the desire to hide, but out of the desire to keep both of them and everyone else in the timeline safe. Which meant that morning, when he just didn't say anything and let her look into him, she knew that he really was hiding something. Not blurring the image for their safety, but trying to throw the wool over her eyes so he could keep a secret. I've been avoiding her. She was tired enough yesterday from helping set up her own culture festival and her patrols that I was able to slip out for the night before she could catch me. I ran away, but I know I can't forever. Izuku sighed, shaking his head and opening up his news app. I trust her, I really do, but it's like I told AM. Someone knowing about One for All means someone being involved with All for One. I don't want any of them getting hurt because they know something they shouldn't. Roomy's smiling face, followed by those of her siblings, flashed across his mind's eye and the young hero felt his whole body tense. I wouldn't be able to forgive myself if any of them got hurt because of me. Which didn't really give him a solution to his problem. Roomy was still bound to find out, now that she'd seen for herself what was hidden in Izuku's heart, and really, he wasn't sure he'd be able to keep it from her if it came down to it. He was bad under that kind of pressure, and the rabbit girl knew how to pressure him. Now, he was certain that if he told her it was a dangerous secret and that someone important to him had asked that it be kept under wraps, she'd understand, but he also knew it would leave a crack between them that the black-haired teen very selfishly, he might add, did not want. Roomy was his pillar right now. She was. He wouldn't have been able to function as he had been if she hadn't offered herself up as his crutch. The cold in his chest would have consumed him by now if she hadn't been there to offer him her and her family's warmth. I haven't had any real mental break since coming here, which is surprising and great, but it's also because of Roomy. She knows when I'm wearing thin and has always been there to help keep me from falling apart. I don't think I could handle it if there was anything separating us like that. I'd shatter. Which sounded dependent and unhealthy, and maybe it was, but it was also just Izuku's reality at this point. He was stuck in the past, with no real hope of getting home, and no real promise that one of these days he wasn't just going to up and blink out of existence. Which, if you didn't know, was a really stressful situation to be living in. He was walking around every day with the full knowledge that it very well might be his last, and it was exhausting. It didn't help that his hero situation had brought him face to face with the cruel reality of the world he'd been unprepared or maybe unwilling to look at. So many fake heroes who really didn't care about the people they were supposed to be protecting and, as such, were unwilling or maybe incapable of doing their jobs. It was so bad that the freaking yakuza were essentially paying Izuku to do it for them. Sure, their deal didn't involve money, but the idea was essentially the same. The mafia was paying someone to be a hero. If that didn't show exactly how messed up everything was, the dark-haired teen didn't know what would. And so through all of this messed up everything, Roomy had become the person he leaned on in his weakness. The one who sat with him as he cried angry tears on the roof and who drank sake with him after a particularly hard day. The one who kept him standing, kept him moving forward in a time that Izuku knew he'd become susceptible to just collapsing. So yes. To tell the truth, the ninth holder was very much considering telling the future pro about One for All, purely because he didn't think he could handle anything coming between them. Scrolling past a couple dumb articles that the hero chuckled to himself about having read before, in the future, during his studies, he found one that caught his attention. Terrible trio strikes again. Sakura Takemoto. Cocking his head a bit, Izuku began reading. He'd been hearing things about the villain group for the last couple weeks, and the reports about them were only getting worse. At first, he thought they were just a couple random thugs who'd been able to form a cohesive enough unit to escape capture. Impressive, surely, but not really anything to warrant special attention. But then they kept escaping, and the body count continued to climb, and the young hero felt his stress level rise along with it. From random civilians to pro heroes, the group was obviously worth their salt. They were slaves, known for kidnapping people with naturally powerful quirks and selling them off before the police could even come close to a rescue attempt. They took someone, and that person disappeared. End of story. Izuku hadn't been all that worried at first because he'd never heard of them before, and so he figured some high-ranked hero or another would take care of them eventually and everything would be fine. Izuku knew that All Might hadn't been involved because then he definitely would have heard of them, but then, that didn't mean anyone from the upper echelons of the Hero Association wouldn't be. And now the number 16 pro hero was dead, and he was getting worried. He couldn't help it. As much as he knew the situation would end up resolving itself, as long as he didn't get involved, he also couldn't help the natural desire in his chest to get involved. People were getting hurt, lives were being ruined, and Izuku wanted to do anything but just sit there. However, he was also not an idiot. He understood that he couldn't afford to do anything as reckless and stupid as track down some infamous villain team. So, as he watched the squad cars approach from down the street and tucked away his phone, he banished the terrible trio from his thoughts. After getting everything all taken care of, the young hero waved goodbye and made his way back to the apartment. Maybe if I hurry, I can catch a short nap. Roomy has a game today, so I'm gonna need some kind of shut-eye. Golden rays of light began peeking over the horizon, and Izuku felt like he just might cry. He also felt like someone might be watching him, but the shadows gave nothing away, so he was left to his pity party as he made his way home. I'm gonna need some coffee. A steady stream of families entering the shabby school told Izuku that they were right on time. There weren't nearly as many people as had been at the middle school festival the day before, but it was still a decent amount, and so the little group made sure they stayed packed together as they entered. With the two boys showing their student IDs, Izuku was happy to say he'd been able to avoid paying for more than one full-price ticket. With AM getting in for free, and Daichi and Arata getting the student discount, he only had to pay for himself. Not that it makes me any less guilty. They've been paying for everything over the last couple months. At least he'd scheduled for a meet-up with Miss Kageyama's nephew on Monday. Having his own income would make the black-haired teen much more comfortable, especially considering he might be able to sneak some of it into the Isagiyama's monthly fund. They'd been letting him live rent-free, and it had long since left a bitter taste in the young man's mouth. The least he could do was pay for groceries or something. Maybe if he got some more students, he could even get Roomy to let them go shopping. Get everyone a new outfit or something. Unlikely, unless I bug her about it. When she told me that first day that she hated handouts, she really meant it. Which is awfully ironic considering how generous she is. Izuku sighed. Problems for another time, he supposed. Up there, AM pointed the group towards a section of the bleachers off to the side and about halfway up. It will be the best place to watch from and will also offer us the best vantage point for the use of our secret weapon. The three boys looked at each other, a bit confused, but followed her dutifully anyway. After getting set up in the stands and making a quick trip to the snack bar for a cup of black coffee for Izuku and a bag of Doritos for AM, the lavender-haired child began giving them her pre-game analysis. Overall, we're at a disadvantage. The little girl picked a chip out of her bag and bit it in half, drawing the group's attention away from the girls who were warming up on the court really. Izuku swore he hadn't been staring at the sibling's older sister, but it wasn't like they believed him as she cocked her head and thought. They're a far more experienced team. Almost all of their starting lineup is in their third year, and we only have Roomy. So what? We beat them last year, didn't we? Daichi asked, eyes tracking a sparrow that had somehow snuck into the gym and was bouncing between the steel rafters, his tail swaying casually behind him as he stalked the bird. Yeah, fur ball, but that was last year. AM's right. Daichi growled a bit at his brother, but Arata continued on anyway. Their team has a lot better chemistry than ours because they've all played together for years. In comparison, we have a first year starting for varsity. All the third years from last year are gone, so. Nana, I'm not an idiot, meow Daichi cut in, I understand, I just didn't know. The rabbit-eared boy gave him a look, but didn't say anything. Probably wanted to comment on the I'm not an idiot portion, but held his tongue, if only barely. Brothers, no fighting. Yes, am. Izuku laughed a bit, smiling at them, as he patted the little girl on the head. So, you were saying am? He prompted, and she smiled. Humming a bit in contentment from the head pat, she continued. Like they said, the other team is far more experienced. Well, that's counteracted a bit by Roomy's sheer athleticism, it doesn't bring their stats up enough that they're evenly matched. She scratched at her cheek, as she explained, and Izuku casually wiped the dust off for her. It's like everyone on the other team is a level 5, and they get an overall stat boost because they have a good team comp. Meanwhile, we have an average level of 4 and a low-level team comp, but Roomy is a level 7 maybe 8, depending. She's really good, but she can't carry the whole team when she's playing this kind of game. Am shrugged, and Izuku felt his lips pull up a little bit. I sometimes forget what she thinks about the game. Reminds me a bit of Kaken, or. The young hero shivered, cutting off his train of thought. Probably best not to compare the young child to Shigaraki. So what, are we going to lose? Daichi asked, a real kind of curiosity in his eyes, as he looked to his sister for an answer. She shrugged. I didn't say that. It really depends at the moment. On what? Arata asked. On how well our ace is going to work. She replied like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Our ace? Izuku asked, and the little girl gave him a quirky smile that reminded the black-haired teen frighteningly of her older sister. It was sharp and filled her sunset eyes with a strength that spoke of her rock-solid confidence. It told him she knew exactly what she was doing and that whatever it was, whatever she was going to do, Izuku had a pretty good chance of either not liking it or being on the receiving end of pain because of it. Perhaps both. Though, maybe I'm reading a bit too far into this. That's only what that look means when Roomy has it. Maybe Am's going to be different. The smirk, which was plastered across her face, and the burning fire in her eyes that promised victory and a brutal end for whatever stood in her way, told him otherwise. Maybe. Yes, our ace. Yet, Izuku did not like the way she was looking at him. Oh, okay, taking a long drag from his paper cup of sweet black caffeinated goodness, the young hero let the three siblings descend into their usual banter and felt himself giving the gym a once-over. Even if he hadn't seen much of the school, as there was a direct entrance to the gym that all those who'd come for the game had come through, it was pretty easy to tell that NHH or knew how to high wasn't in much better shape than the middle school which fed into it. Apparently, it was the only school with a hero program that the little family could afford, and so they'd packed up and left behind their older safer apartment and city and found the little spot they were in now. Roomy had felt terrible. She told him so in a fit of inebriated tears that he'd sworn never to speak about, not that such an oath needed, what happens on the roof stays on the roof, and all that about having to move them, but it had been her only shot at getting into the hero business, and since she'd just taken over as unofficial head of house about a year prior. She was a little too willing to leave behind the place that had held so many toxic memories. Really though, this place is a dump. Just like middle school. How many violations would someone find if they really went though this place? A small frown spread across Izuku's features. Too many, probably. Let's add probable embezzlement within the school system to the list of things to look into, shall we? The hero shook his head. Hada was proving to be a mess of messes, the perfect example of everything wrong in the world they lived in, and that cold feeling in his chest was beginning to push its ice into his veins once again. His exhaustion meant that he didn't exactly have the energy to repel it either, so it coiled up in his heart and waited patiently for the team to either build up the strength to smash it into something more manageable or to be warmed. The bitterness that washed across his eyes would make one think that he'd probably end up having to do the former. Izuku, pay attention, it's starting. Yeah, come on, pervert. Sis isn't gonna be happy if she finds out that you weren't even watching. And Arata's teasing voices brought him back though, and, as hurting as he was, he still couldn't stop the smile that bloomed across his face and the light that built up if even a little bit in his eyes. He loved these kids, he really did, even if they were a bunch of weirdos, they were his weirdos, and it made all the difference. Oh my, is this how Mr. Ozawa feels about 2A? I feel like if this whole experience has given me anything, then it's a whole new understanding of Mr. Ozawa. Izuku chuckled, but turned away from his thoughts even if they were only funny, because they were just freaking true and towards the court where one of his weirdos was about to start a game. Some dark hole in Izuku's mind whispered something about him, referred to her as his weirdo, and then tried to turn him back into a vegetable through the memories of that previous morning, which he fought off with a brutality that would have made Shigaraki wince, because he did not need to be thinking about that, not when Roomy was down there playing volleyball in those freaking shorts. Trust him, he was struggling enough, as is. No need to throw one more straw onto the camel's back. Let's go, Roomy. Daichi cried, and the game began. Surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, things went according to AM's prediction. Roomy was incredible, no doubt about it, and if she wasn't looking to go into heroism, then Izuku would have pushed her towards a future in the sport. Her speed and unsurprisingly jumping ability far outmatched any of the other players, but AM was also right about the other thing. It was a team game, and so when someone made a mistake, the whole team suffered. And her teammates made a lot more mistakes than their competitors. The young hero felt like it made an odd amount of sense. It was the same way in a fight, after all, if two sides were evenly matched, then it simply came down to whoever made the most mistakes. Whenever he and Roomy sparred, that was always how things were decided, all it took was a little something after all, and the tides of a battle, or in this case a game, could turn. To their credit, it wasn't a blowout. Not even close. In fact, Roomy's team kept up fairly well, but they just weren't there, they were missing something, a little push to, as AM would say, raise their levels enough to actually make a difference. Izuku smiled a small, sad smile as he watched the teams break before the start of the last quarter. They're probably going to lose. Feeling someone pulling on his sleeve, Izuku looked down to meet the sunset eyes of AM, who was wearing the same face she had been earlier and giving the black-haired hero the most confident, joyous grin she could have possibly mustered. Izuku, it's time. Time for what, AM? He asked, curious and careful and just a little bit afraid. For the ace. She turned to face the court, still beaming, as her siblings gave her confused looks. We're going to win. Wah, but AM, everything you said was right. Daichi scratched his head, his ears twitching. We're going to lose, aren't we? No. Because we have the ace. The ace changes the rules and gives us an unfair boost that wouldn't be available otherwise. She explained, giving the time traveler a side eye. So Izuku, I'm going to need you to stand up and cheer for Roomy as loud as you can. The confused noise was echoed by all three of the boys, and AM just shook her head and groaned. Trust me. Just do it and we'll win. But I mean, Izuku stuttered, sweat peeling down his neck. Sports haven't ever been my thing. How do I cheer for her? He was being completely honest. Besides sports festivals, he'd never been to such an event. Wasn't wanted there when he was in middle school and didn't have the time or reason in UA. How was one supposed to cheer for someone in a sports game like this? He didn't know, and AM looked beyond disappointed. Izuku himself hadn't felt such intense scrutiny since that first day at UA, when Mr. Izawa had almost expelled him. Thus cheer for her, Izuku, in whatever way you know how. She shook her head again and sat down. Unless you want her to lose. Well, I don't want that. Sweating nervously, the young man thought. The only things he'd ever really cheered for were fights All Might against All For One being the most prominent memory, and so was he really supposed to cheer for her like he cheered for those? The teams were returning to the court now, and the youngest Usagiyama spoke. You have 5 seconds of Izuku, or our window of opportunity vanishes. She looked at him with those seeing, piercing eyes of hers, and the boy leapt to his feet in a panic. He just went with it. Roomy. He screamed, catching the attention of just about everyone and their mothers. He was embarrassed. He hated social stuff like this even if he'd been getting better, but if it was to help his friend, then, well, he'd do it. Meeting the young woman's scorching eyes from across the massive room, he raised a single fist high into the air and lost a roaring shout of encouragement. Win. All was quiet for a moment, and the eldest Usagiyama seemed to be processing, eyes wide and ears tucked back a bit before a massive grin broke out across her face, and she lifted her own fist. And then the cheers started up again. Louder than before, as the teams returned to the court and the game was finished. For Roomy, it was like a switch had been flipped, and if AM had said before that she was a level 8, then Izuku could only assume that she'd somehow jumped to a level 10. In the end, they won, and AM was wearing a proud, conniving little smirk that was covered only by the sheer cuteness that she embodied. Once everything was over, the little group moved down towards the bench and towards the team who'd mostly finished packing up their things and were now talking with each other and whatever family had sought to approach and congratulate them on their victory. Roomy was surrounded by her friends and classmates, and it wasn't until he caught sight of a familiar carrot top that Izuku realized this might have been a bad idea. Deku. She'd found him. The little eep that the young hero let out surprised even him, as he thought he'd finally kicked his sleeping habit. Turns out, not so much. The smiling, orange-haired girl was suddenly before the little group, smiling broadly, as Izuku tried very hard not to make it obvious that he was positioning Daichi and Arata between the crazy teenage girl and himself. Tori, right. I haven't seen you in a while. He trailed off a bit, the younger Usagiyama's looking confused at his blatant anxiety. Because I threatened to kill you last time? Perhaps. Or maybe it's because you're freaking crazy. Don't worry, Deku. That's water under the bridge now. Since you convinced your girlfriend to play, we're all good. She smiled, giving him a thumbs up as the young hero felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. Girlfriend? Arata and Daichi muttered, things clicking into place for them as they turned slowly to face the older teen behind them with dead eyes that promised nothing but pain in the foreseeable future. The carrot top sputtered in what was probably a laugh, but hidden, as it was within the dark aura that covered the faces of the boys who were sending an intense glare his way. Izuku felt like it sounded more like a formal invitation to his own funeral. Well yeah, duh. This is Deku. Roomy's boyfriend. Wait, aren't you her siblings? How didn't you know this? The time traveler was now backing up very slowly, hands raised, as the two younger brothers of his supposed girlfriend proceeded to prowl closer and closer, murder in their eyes. Releasing a twin roar from their throats, they leapt after him, and Izuku tried to make his escape, turning around and booking it in what his homeroom teacher might call a strategic retreat. Guys, it's not what you think. Shut up, meow. Like we believe you. Stay away from our sisters, you fiend. And so, in a fit of deja vu, Izuku was chased around the gym until the two's little sister took pity on him and told them to stop embarrassing them, sending them into a depressive pile on the ground as they gave her yes ma'am and began crying about cruelty and the sweet princess who was just too young to understand. Sister complex, I swear. Taking a deep breath and relishing in the fact that he'd been spared from the wrath of the twin brothers, if only for a moment, he was about to return to AM's side when someone else caught his attention. So you're Deku, huh? One of the girls from the team asked as Tori reappeared and the dread in Izuku's stomach did along with her. Yup, this is Roomy's man. At first I hated him because I blamed him for her not trying out, but apparently he convinced her to join up for her last year, so. The girl shrugged and the rest of the team began gathering around him as though he were some odd alien species. Poking and prodding at him in much the same way Daichi and Arata had when they'd first met him. Face heating up, the black-haired hero tried to say something, clear up the situation, but all that came out was half-formed words and noises as he was encircled and talked about as though he weren't right there. I mean, I can to see it. He seems built under the baggy clothing, so we can't see it, but I bet he's stacked. I mean, didn't Roomy say he was like a hero or something? Like, maybe a sidekick? I don't know, I wasn't really listening. Yeah, which explains the buffness. Kinda plain though. Bitch, I'm pretty sure he's like the definition of an average Japanese male if you went back to like 2010 or something. Minus the muscles. True, but he's cute in his own way. Freckles are nice. Izuku was going to die. This was it, his brain was going to roast between his ears from the sheer heat of his face. Someone save me please. Like an answer to his prayer, someone did. Hey. What the frick are you guys doing? Back up, will ya? Roomy pushed them all aside, AM trailing cutely behind her like a duckling would its mother. Jesus Christ, you're gonna freaking kill him. Oh, we were just getting a closer look. You've never shown us any pictures before, so we had to inspect the merchandise ourselves. One of the taller girls, who had dark hair and reminded him a bit of Yamomo, shrugged, a devious grin on her face. Our bad, didn't mean to encroach on your claim. Deku's not a merchandise to Aiko, and he's not for sale. Now back up, haven't you all ever heard of personal space? Hands raised peacefully, but a teasing grin still present on her face, Aiko and the rest of the girls stepped back to give him room. Jesus, you good Deku? You look fried. Thank you. He felt like he might collapse, but he waved her off anyway. He wasn't about to kick the bucket to some high school girls after having survived all the shit he had, even though it felt like for just a second he just might. I'm good. Good. Now let's go. She shrugged their shared gym bag which had been doubling as her volleyball bag over her shoulder and motioned for the door. With Daichi and Arata appearing behind her, Izuku was all too willing to get as far away from the volleyball team as possible. Nodding, he followed dutifully behind the group, sandwiching the younger children between him and Roomy to make sure they didn't lose anyone in the crowd, anyone being Daichi really, because he was easily distracted as the group of girls called out to them as they fled the scene. Come on Roomy. We promised to play nice. Sorry Deku. That one was Inori, the orange-haired Chihuahua's friend and the one who dragged her off when they first met. Also the only one who hadn't been inspecting him. Don't worry guys, I bet he'll come to some other games, so we'll have another chance. That was the Chihuahua. Smiling a bit nervously, Izuku carefully did not look backwards, speeding up as he herded the group out as fast as he could. This is why I don't do social stuff. Checking his phone for the time, as the little family made their way out onto the sidewalk, he noted it was just about 4 p.m. Just about to hit rush hour on a Saturday, which meant, "Hey Roomy." Holding up his phone, the green-eyed hero gave her a strained smile as they came to a stop on the street corner. "It's about 4 o'clock. Turning to meet his gaze, she seemed to be questioning what he meant before her eyes widened and she dragged a hand across her face, groaning. Shoot, dang it. Moving towards her, as though reading her mind, Izuku caught the volleyball gym bag as she tossed it to him and smiled as she took off in the other direction. "I'll catch you guys later, okay? I gotta go for a patrol." The siblings seemed a bit put out, calling out half-enthusiastic goodbyes as their sister dashed away, but after throwing the strap of the little duffel over his shoulder, Izuku smiled and waved as the rabbit hero disappeared down the street and dropped a hand down onto a shoulder of either boy as they turned to face him. "I don't think we have a whole lot at the house, how about we go out to eat tonight?" he asked. Well, the unspoken "we're not usually allowed out at night" was right there at the tip of Arata's tongue, but he didn't need to say it for Izuku to hear it. "It's okay. As long as you're with me or Roomy, it's fine." He smiled in that beaming cinnamon roll way and watched as a little bit of joy returned to the siblings. "What do you say? I know a couple good spots we can check out. One of which is only the best ramen stand in the world." Simultaneously, the three siblings' stomachs growled and Izuku laughed. Food, the key to every Usagi-yama's heart. Ramen is the boy's favorite, too. Herding them onward, in the same direction that Roomy had run off in, and towards the heart of town, the older teen gave directions as he led from behind, unwilling to have any of them leave his direct line of sight. Hada was still Hada after all, and Izuku wasn't about to let his guard drop just because it was daytime and he could see a hero standing on the next corner. No, he was not. Making their way into the center of town, the group eventually found themselves at a little back alley ramen shop that Izuku had discovered a while ago. It was owned by a sweet old man and his daughter and was called "Are You Ready for This? I Know You Are Naraku Ramen." Anyway, the place was awesome and opened stupidly late enough that Izuku had sometimes found himself stopping for a bowl during the little breaks he gave himself while out on patrol. Honestly, the owner slept less than he did. Something about catching all the hungry drunks when they leave the bars being his excuse for staying open so incredibly late. He was also one of the few people who weren't criminals that knew Deku existed, at least the hero, so the two of them shared a nice relationship. Not that the man would be able to tell it was him. He always wore his mask, after all, and had long since mastered the technique that Shoji used when eating to avoid removing his covering. He had to say, it was hilarious, and he knew why his larger tentacled classmate enjoyed using it so much. There was just something about watching as one's eyes widened in shock and confusion as you stared at them over a finished bowl of food and they desperately tried to do the maths in their head as to how you finished that without me noticing, you crazy freak. It was one of the fun parts about going to Naraku. The tired man would try to catch Izuku eating and would never be able, causing him to want to catch him more. Offering up little coupons and deals to keep the fake pro coming back as he attempted to catch him in the act. He never did. So slipping into the shop, which sat just inside an alleyway on the main road, the little family ordered their food and Izuku's smile became a little more mischievous as he ordered one of his favorites with a cup of tea and talked happily with the old man and his daughter as they prepared it. After giving the children his recommendations, he just sat and listened as the siblings descended into a bit of their regular banter and the old man eyed them with a little gleam of confusion passing through his face. "So are they yours?" he asked after a while, causing Izuku to choke on his tea and giving they whiplash from how fast they turned to face him. No, Midoriya coughed again, pounding a bit on his chest as he shook his head violently and the Usagi-yamas, though predominantly the boys, gave the old shopkeeper the most disgusted look they could muster. AM looked pensive. "They are not." My bad. You never know these days." The old man chuckled, raising his hands uncomfortably. "It's just, the cat-eared one at least looks a little like you, so I figured young father or older brother." Daichi looked like he might throw up and Izuku was really no better. "How busy do you have to assume Izuku's been if he had 3 children?" Arata sounded horrified and was talking more to himself than anyone else and the old man was very obviously sweating now. Sorry. I'm a curious old man, I didn't mean to make you all uncomfortable." Behind him, his daughter sighed heavily. "Dad. Well, I suppose that to someone who doesn't know us, it wouldn't be all that far-fetched," AM proposed, sipping her juice through the straw she'd been given and gripping the cup with both hands. If Roomy were here, it probably would have only added validity to the theory, considering she and Arata share the same mutant features. She put her hands behind her head to simulate her siblings' rabbit ears. The unspoken accusation, then, was that it would have been assumed that he and Roomy were. That we and they. Izuku felt the glares before he saw them and was suddenly very happy that AM had chosen to sit between him and her older brothers. And besides, the little girl was looking down now, staring into her juice cup like it might hold all the answers in the world. Her voice was heavy now and so very sad. When she spoke again, it was quiet and almost too soft to hear. Isn't it like there are parents anyway? It was silent, dead silent, as the sharp impact of her words struck everyone there, from the siblings to the ramen shop workers. She looked like she wanted to cry, and there was a deep pain, the same deep pain from their conversation the day before, swelling up in her sunset eyes. "Hey, look, meow." Daichi suddenly cried, pointing towards an old arcade whose entrance sat just opposite the ramen shop's alleyway. "An arcade? AM, do you want to go with me? Come on. I really want to try that, meow, that dancing game. Come on, come on." He leapt from his chair, thoughts of ramen lost, as a desperation built up in his green eyes. "You can totally wreck all of their high scores. Let's go." Grabbing her hand, he smiled wide at the little girl, who rubbed at her eyes for a moment before nodding and scooting off the chair to join her older brother. "We'll be right over there, Izuku. You can still see us, so it'll be okay," Daichi called as he ran off, giving the older teen a thumbs up and a wide-fanged grin as he ran, his little sister trailing behind him. At their leaving, silence descended on the shop once again. "I'm sorry, I didn't know it would be." "Shut up, Dad," his daughter hissed, and the man did. Izuku felt something painful squeezing his heart as the duo scurried away, AM's words echoing around in his head. "I'll wait for them to get back to finish up their bowls. Or just take it off the tab," the owner sighed, meeting the time traveler's eyes as he gave an unspoken apology. "Thank you," he murmured, a soft smile spreading across his features. "I appreciate it. More and more, I see myself in her. Without a father, I latched onto All Might and Mr. Izawa for such a role. Does AM see Roomy like a mother? Or me, like a father?" It made a startling amount of sense, really. She was incredibly young, even if her intelligence made him sometimes forget she was, and he'd been around long enough at this point that she could have begun integrating him into her own little mental family. It was basic psychology, and for a little girl, as blunt and sometimes disconnected as she was, it wasn't hard for Izuku to assume she'd simply begun thinking about the situation like that. Everyone else had a mother and father, after all, so he and Roomy must have just been slotted into those roles for the quirkless girl. Sure, Roomy was her sister, but she was also her caretaker and had been for a large portion, if not all, of the lavender-haired child's memories. And then Izuku showed up and was an older, at least from her position, man in the house who'd taken up a lot of the household responsibilities and integrated into a semi-caretaker role on instinct. He loved kids, was a hero at heart, and had himself grown up in a less than average family situation. While he was far softer than Roomy and wielded far less authority within the household, he could look back now and see how his words did hold a bit of weight. He could ask because he never told anyone what to do if Daichi thought watching Netflix before doing his homework was a good idea, and he'd sulk over to his bag and get it done, or throw Arata a glance when the boy's sarcastic comments began holding a real bite, and Izuku knew Daichi was getting upset and the boy would stop. And then, wasn't it just yesterday that he had the heart-to-heart with AM that he'd wished someone would have given to him when he was her age? That maybe, in the dark parts of his heart, he'd wished that the father who'd left them would have sat down and had with him. No, the idea that the little girl had come to such a conclusion wasn't far-fetched at all. Izuku frowned a bit. He just didn't know what to do about the situation. Should he try to make himself seem less fatherly, explain to her that it wasn't like that and that he wasn't planning on staying forever? Because what happened then? If AM began seeing him like a parental figure and then he disappeared like her previous ones? The cold bit into the young hero's heart and he shook his head, hissing, as he felt like he was backed into a corner. "I'll figure something out. Talk to Roomy about it later. Maybe she'll have some ideas." Ramen served, the two remaining patrons ate in silence as the owner's daughter began humming a little tune as she clicked around on her phone, smiling as the speakers began playing a soft lofi song and she went back to her work. The music filled the silence, and, as they ate, the air became less bitter in Izuku's lungs, and he was able to break the invisible chokehold which was gripping the group. "That's a nice drawing, Arata. You're really skilled," Izuku commented, looking down at where the boy had begun nervously sketching on the kids' menu that AM had been given. It was of a large cherry tree atop a hill, with a single figure standing beneath it. The tree was awesome, but the person was a bit wonky. Recognizing the mistakes, as ones he himself had made many times before, Izuku reached over to gesture with his pinky. "Oh, see this here? The angle of the arm, as it's coming out of the shoulder, is a bit off. Dropping his chopsticks, Izuku picked up the crayon and quickly doodled his own figure, accenting the right arm, which was stretched upwards towards the sky. See the difference? Arata watched him as he drew, sighing and shaking his head. Yeah. People are hard. I've been practicing, but they just aren't my style. Izuku chuckled, going back to his food. You'll get the hang of it, it just takes a bit of time. He smiled at the rabbit-eared boy. You're already loads better than I was when I was your age, so you'll probably learn a lot faster too. Still looking over the doodle Izuku had thrown together, the boy looked put out. You're really good. Izuku shook his head. Not really. I can only do people, nothing else. He took another bite. I love doing quirk analysis and stuff, and so growing up I filled tons of journals with pictures of heroes and notes on their abilities, uses for their quirks and stuff. The black-haired teen cocked his head to the side, smiling awkwardly. You should see the earlier notebooks. Not pretty. Arata laughed, and Izuku smiled. I feel you. The boy grinned, his bangs parting just enough for Izuku to catch the heterochromatic eyes which lay beneath them. I remember when I first started it wasn't great. It never is. Midoriya shook his head, smiling, as they descended into a far more comfortable silence. Do you think, I don't know, Arata seemed a bit embarrassed now, looking off to the side and scratching his cheek to play off his question, as not a big deal. You could give me some tips from time to time. No one else is good at art, so. Izuku beamed. Of course. Arata was a bit red-faced now, but a small smile had found its way into his features and the pain from earlier had seemed to disperse. I'm gonna go find AM and the fur brain. He suddenly said, hopping off his chair and shoving his hands in his pockets. Get them to come eat. Sounds good. Izuku gave a thumbs up but watched the boy carefully as he crossed the square and entered the arcade, never looking away until he was safely within the other building. They're good kids. The old man smiled, moving towards the door which led to the storage room. As he spoke, I can tell. And then he was gone. Ah, dang. The man's daughter sighed. Dad. Wait, don't forget to grab some more Naruto, yeah? Following the old restaurant owner into the back, Izuku was left alone with his thoughts. At least, he was, but only for a moment. His eyes found the figure in the shadows before they could approach, and he let one for all leak out just a little. You. The hero's voice was sharp now, dangerous. You've been following me. Who are you, and what do you want? Deku. The man stepped forward, out of the shadows, and Izuku felt his heart leap into his throat. This guy. His nose was still there, and he wasn't dressed anything like he'd been the last time the time traveler had seen him, but one didn't just forget a guy like this. Even as he was now, Izuku knew with a truth that sat deep in his bones who this man was, what he was, and what he would become. Who I am doesn't matter much, Chizumakaguro said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. However, what does matter, Deku? Blood-red eyes met glowing Viridian, and something passed between them. Is who you are. Shit. Izuku couldn't help the mental curse, as he kept a tight grip on Ofa, ready to let it roar forth at a moment's notice, but otherwise keeping it simmering just below the mental surface of his hold. His power coiled and hissed in his blood at the sight of such a dangerous and familiar foe, and the young hero almost couldn't keep it from lashing out instinctively. Damn it. Stain. Shit, what is he doing here? Unless. The teen had honestly never dedicated himself to learning about his once dangerous adversary. He decided then and there right after the fight in the alley, and the man had saved him and paralyzed a group of pro-heroes with a look that he'd much rather forget about such a terrifying opponent, such a rattling experience. And to peer even deeper into the man who'd been feared throughout Japan and attracted so many to the league's cause. Maybe it really was because the experience had shaken him and he really wanted to forget. But then again, maybe it was because he was terrified of finding a kindred spirit within the serial killer. Either way, he'd violently shunned all such interest and simply taken Chizumakaguro at face value. A powerful man with a powerful conviction and one who'd attracted many to the side of Izuku's enemies. And that was it. He'd stop there. Anxious and fearful at finding what was lurking in the shadows of his own heart, that growing cold which had made itself at home in his chest these last few months and might have howled at the man's ideals like a dog towards the call of its brethren. He didn't agree with the man, he never could RIGHT. But that didn't mean his ideals were that far-fetched, and with his own past, Izuku knew he would have been susceptible to such an alluring idea as fixing an unfair world. So he closed his eyes, plugged his ears, and moved on with his life. Now though. Damn it, I was an idiot. If I'd looked into him, I might have known. Had some sort of warning. He must be from Hada. The worst of the worst when it comes to careers, he and all of his ideas must have been born and bred here. It makes so much sense. Because it did. Hadn't Izuku, the ninth holder of One for All and a UA student, been disenfranchised with the current system from just half a year of living in the crap town? If so, then how much more would a man who'd grown up there and had never seen the good in the world, never had the chance that Izuku had have become disgusted with the state of things? Even to the point of becoming such a notorious villain as the hero killer. Yes, it made a startling amount of sense. Not that knowing that solved any of the teen's current problems, because it didn't. Who are you, Deku? The man seemed honestly curious, something gleaming in those red eyes of his that was alarmingly familiar to the teen. Familiar, because he'd seen the same longing shadow hanging in his own eyes every time he came back from a particularly draining patrol and would level an almost unseeing stare at himself in the mirror as he felt the length of the day and the weight of his self-appointed responsibilities come crashing down on him. When he would just sit there, looking into his own eyes, as exhaustion warped the world around him, and ask the same question that herself had without speaking, a heart-level, wordless ask that previous morning. Why is the world so broken? And? What are you going to do to fix it, Izuku Midoriya? Even before his conversation with the girl, such an idea had been hanging heavily on him, and from the mere glimpse he'd gotten into Stain's heart, he knew that the older man must be asking himself the same exact questions. And so Izuku was left with a chilling realization. Me and Stain, we're in the same place right now. We're both asking the same questions, looking for the same answers. Me and the hero killer. Right now, we're the same. It scared him more than he cared to admit, and he couldn't control the panic that rose in his chest as he fought off the truth which was weaving itself into the threads of his mind. No. We're not the same. We'll never be the same. I would never hurt people like he will. I'm not him. We're different. I'm going to be like All Might, not like him. And yet, the cold whispered to him its harsh truth, and even as Izuku fought to reject it, he couldn't shake its twisted voice from where it was humming sweet songs into the marrow of his bones. You're not like All Might, not at all. What do you mean? The young hero asked, attempting to sound strong despite the turmoil which was roaring within. The future villain stared at him for a moment, like he was looking for something, before continuing. You're different. I can tell. You're not like those fakes. He spat the word with such disgust it was astounding, so I want to know the difference. Between you and them. Chisholm practically hissed it, and there was a fervent desperation in his voice. An impassioned need for a truth in this world of lies, an anchor, before he drifted away into nothing. That much, at least, was clear to the terror-stricken teen. Because he felt the exact same way. Heart drumming in his ears, Izuku did the mental maths on how much time he'd have before any of the children, or the ramen shop owners, returned, because he had to find a way to finish this up before then. Before they added themselves to this already disastrous equation, things went from bad to worse. And be more than a couple minutes. So tell me, hero, what is your conviction? He went with what had worked last time, or really, what would work in the future. Maybe he should have taken into account that this wasn't the future, but hey, he panicked, and it was the first thing that came to mind. I'm Deku. I'm the hero who wants to save everyone with a smile, and the one who will meddle even when I don't need to. Even when I'm not wanted. He spoke with resilience, with strength, but it felt forced, like he was a sword trying to be a hammer. Because that's the essence of being a hero. The guttural growl echoed from the man's throat, and he glared while his hands shifted around in his hoodie pocket. No. Chisholm was frustrated now, angry, and with the memories of that day in Hosu overwhelming him, Izuku almost flinched backwards. Almost. The ghoulish form of the man's future self hovering behind him like a vengeful wraith, the one who would one day be known as the hero killer turned to him with a bloody purpose, warping his features. That's not what I asked for. It's partial, half-formed, and not strong enough. You're just quoting someone you've heard before, there's no conviction in what you're saying. He stopped now, breathing deeply, as he calmed himself down. You're different, and you have potential, but you're half-baked and searching, aren't you? Chisholm's blood-red gaze met Izuku's own, and both of them felt the absolute truth of what he said next. You're just like me. He shook his head, sighing. I'm sorry, Deku. I thought maybe the Phantom would have some answers, but it seems like we're both just people with potential. Neither one of us has found our truth yet. Neither one of us has found our resolve. At least he looked at the young hero again, a little bit of something painting his features as he pulled up his hood. Not all of it anyway. I'll be watching. And then, as quickly as he appeared, he moved to leave. However, stricken by a desperation that he'd felt only once before that day, under the bridge with All Might, Izuku called out for the villain. Wait. What do you mean? He sounded desperate. He knew he sounded desperate, and that's because he was, but at that moment, he didn't care. Something within him was snapping into place with the man's words, and he felt the need to help it click. Turning over his shoulder, Izuku knew Chisholm was smiling, even if he couldn't see it. The ideal that you hold in your heart. Your guiding light in this dark world. your answer to the question I can tell just by looking at you has haunted you the same way it has me. Who is the hero Deku, and who are you? What do you represent? What will you become? He faced the other direction again and began walking into the shadows of the twilight. What is your conviction? And then, he was gone. Izuku gasped, falling backwards as he shook. His hand clutched at his heart and his breath became shallow and hurried. Tears formed in his eyes and the world suddenly felt very small and very tight and like it was spinning around him. Choking on his own feelings, on his anxiety and panic because that's what this is, he realized, a panic attack. He slid against the old brick wall of the alleyway and fell to the ground, the strength in his legs abandoning him. He could vaguely make out the phantom image of the owner of Naraku and his daughter rushing to his side and the return of Arata with his siblings, but even if they were right there, even if they were fine, and he was fine, he just couldn't stop shaking. He couldn't even breathe. That's right. Remember what you were taught. Come on Deku, you're a student, a hero, right? You were taught how to deal with things like this. Come on, Dumbus. Nerd. Breathe, just breathe. And so, counting mentally along with the ramen shop owner who was counting out loud and taking it one breath at a time, he felt his heart rate begin to slow and his shaking limbs still. It took him a couple minutes, a couple painful, horrifying minutes, as he had to watch the three children in front of him become petrified at seeing the older boy in such a state. What kind of hero was he, letting them see him like that to calm down? But once he did, he lifted a hand to Aem's head and let it rest there as tears streamed down the child's face. Hey, it's okay. He hushed, pulling her close as she sobbed, and her brothers looked on with an uncomfortable stare, the kind of look that said I really want to help, but I don't know how, and made Izuku's heart hurt ache just a little more in his chest. Are you okay? The old man asked from where he'd been standing nearby, helping Izuku regain control of his breathing. My youngest daughter used to get panic attacks when she was smaller, so I knew what was going on at least. Are you okay now? Do you want me to get you some water? Or tea? He asked, keeping his question simple so Izuku could answer them more easily. Shaking his head, the hero replied. Just please help me up, sir. I'd like to sit at the stall if I can. The man nodded and his daughter moved behind the counter as the old chef helped the young man stand. His legs shook a bit, but he was able to make it to the counter just fine, and so with Aem taking her place at the chair next to him, her hand gripping his, as she'd refused to let go, the two boys retook their own seats. It was almost as if nothing that had happened in the last hour had happened at all. As Tucci, the owner, who'd given his name to the small group after helping Izuku up, poured the dark-haired teen another cup of tea and placed Daichi and Aem's bowls of ramen before them, he let them eat in relative silence as the oldest of the group regained his bearings. Damn it. That's the worst I've ever been. I hadn't had a full-on panic attack since coming here, and now I have to go and have one in front of the kids. I freaked them out pretty badly, damn it. Taking another sip from his tea, something Tucci had said was on the house, leading to the time traveler wondering if Hada was just the gathering place for kind, tea-drinking old men. Izuku gathered his courage and spoke. Mr. Tucci said it earlier, but that was a panic attack. I'm sorry for freaking you three out. I hadn't had one in quite a while. Roomy, he fumbled over her name awkwardly. I know we joke sometimes, but your sister is really good at helping me catch them before they get as bad as that just was. It's why you've never seen me have one before. The boy bowed his head, eyes filled with something sad and harsh as he mentally berated himself. I'm sorry. All was quiet for a moment as the siblings shared a look and Aem tugged on his sleeve. Meeting their eyes with his own and feeling like the Midoriya family tears might just start flowing, Izuku felt the tight feeling in his throat as his unshed tears loosened. Izuku Aem's voice was surprisingly strong and the looks her brothers were giving him only strengthened the moment. Don't apologize for something that's out of your control. It's illogical. You can't worry so much about things you can't control. What people think of you, what this world thinks of you, none of it matters. It's not real. So don't worry about the past or the future because you can't control them. The only thing you can control is the now. So live in the now, Aem, he smiled and she began to cry. Free yourself. Izuku smiled a small gentle smile and caught Arata looking away, down towards the kids' menu he'd once again taken to doodling on in a fit of nervous energy. Yeah. The rabbit-eared artist tried to make his voice light, joking. Come on, you idiot. Why would you apologize for something like that? It's dumb. Daichi was uncharacteristically quiet, but there was a quality to the light in his eye now that hadn't been there before. Even as he gave his own 2 cents, the older teen could tell that the younger boy had come to some sort of conclusion that he seemed alright with keeping to himself. Meow. You're strong, aren't you, Deku? He asked, but it wasn't a question. It felt like suddenly, just like that first night he'd met them and he'd told them about his name, something had settled over all three of the younger siblings, something that they seemed to come to a unanimous unspoken agreement on. Whatever it was, it settled over the air like a heavy winter blanket and Izuku couldn't help but smile because of the warmth it brought him. I really do love these kids. And so after finishing up with his tea and paying for what the old owner let him pay for because he tried to put the entire meal on the house, claiming that he'd ruined the group's night or something of the sort, not that Izuku would listen to such nonsense, the little group began making their way home. Making sure to guide from behind so he could keep an eye on all of them, just as he had on the way to Naraku, Izuku began weaving them through the moderate street traffic that came with a Saturday night, though with the sun setting, such traffic was noticeably dwindling, even over the course of their journey home. As the street lamps flickered on, Izuku was suddenly bombarded with an unpleasant feeling of foreboding and prayed that it was merely his already wired nerves overreacting to nothing. Though, he knew, deep down, that such truth was twisted and he should really be preparing himself for whatever was to come. They just made their way past the main square when suddenly, Daichi, who was at the front of the group, stopped, causing Arata to barrel into him with an annoyed huff. Tail waving in the air, his poisonous green eyes scanned the crowd as he searched for someone. The eldest son suddenly grinned ear to ear. "Hey furball, what are you freaking doing?" Arata's comment was cut off as his brother pointed to the side a bit and absolutely purred. "Boo. I think it's Roomy. I think I caught her scent and I'm almost certain I'm right. She's over this way. Come on." He laughed as he took off and, as Izuku's calls for him to stop were ignored, he disappeared down the street. "Daichi, dang it. You two stay with me, okay?" he told the remaining Usajiyama as they gave chase to the dark-haired brother. "Idiot." Arata murmured and Izuku, at least just this once, was inclined to agree. His one rule for being out in the city this late was that they had to stay with him, after all. He'd been very specific with that one, singular rule, and yet. That's spaz. I'm not that surprised, but well, I was at least hoping. Roomy's gonna be pissed, though. Making their way down the sidewalk, a sudden cry caught their attention and pushed them to start moving even faster than before. "Bertard. Watch where you're going." A heavy voice roared and Izuku felt something cold drop into his gut. "What do you think you're doing, sprinting around like that? You could have hurt someone, you fuckwad." Izuku really hoped that some other poor sap who wasn't Daichi that the terrible familiar voice was screaming at, because things would be a lot more simple if that were the case. Unfortunately, things are hardly ever simple. Weaving around the dwindling crowd with one hand on each of the remaining Usajiyama siblings, he found a sight that wouldn't soon be forgotten by any of them. There, on the ground, was Daichi. His eyes were widened in a panic, pupils dilated to thin slits in his obvious fear of the large man, and his ears were pressed flat against his head. His black hair was sticking straight up in alarm and Izuku knew that something was terribly wrong. Because there, above him, was Rain. "You." The hero growled. He was a tall, dark-skinned man who reminded Izuku of a larger, stupider version of Lockdown. His hero costume consisted of a light-colored fur coat with a dark undershirt and a pair of stylish jeans and black leather boots. It's like he's imitating Hawks, but he's too old to pull off the look. Fucking asshole. Izuku didn't hate a lot of people, but he definitely hated Rain. He was overly brutal, showy, shallow, honestly didn't care about the lives of those around him, and was directly responsible for a number of different casualties because of it. The only reason he hadn't had his license revoked was because of the testimony of his fellow career heroes, who'd formed some kind of corrupted council surrounding heroic work in Hutta. If one of them fucked up, the others would cover for them to make them look better and keep them from getting in trouble. It's why none of the reports from the police about the terrible behavior of the heroes nearby reached the Hero Association. At the end of the day, the association believed their own heroes over the cops, so when every fucking bozo or hero in Hutta vouched for whatever other bozo had messed up, they just dropped the case. Izuku hated it, and the cold in his chest seethed at the sight of the man, seeping into his blood and spreading through his limbs at an alarming rate. He felt frozen and angry. "You little bastard, do you have a brain, or are you all animal in there, you little fucker?" Daichi simply sat there, coiled up like a snake, as a high-pitched, warning hiss escaped him at a constant rate. He was obviously intimidated enough that his more feline instincts had kicked in, and Izuku knew himself enough to know that if he didn't do something right then, he was probably going to regret what ended up happened next, because what happened next wouldn't be pretty, and would probably be incredibly painful for the damnable pro-hero in front of him. And draw unwanted attention to the black-haired time traveler. "I need to get Daichi out of there and cool Rain's jets about this whole thing. I'll have to butter him up a bit and it'll make me sick, but if I suck up to him, everything should be okay. As long as nothing bad happens." And then something bad happened. "Are you deaf?" Rain reached down, angry at his lack of a response, and made a grab for Daichi's collar, and the boy reacted. Claw-like nails flashing out and forward in an amazing burst of speed, Usagi made a powerful swipe for the hand which was coming near him and struck the dark-skinned man in the forearm. Blood splashed across the concrete and Daichi released a throaty, violent hiss. Rain cursed as he flinched back, cradling his injured arm as blood stained his nice white coat. "You little villain, this was new." He said it with a smile on his face and something shifted in his posture. Reaching backwards with his uninjured hand, Rain went to attack, a thick fog cloaking his arm as it thickened, becoming semi-physical, and formed a sharp clawed appendage as he struck downwards towards the panicked middle school student. Izuku didn't even think. No, thinking was beyond him at that point as the freezing rage in his chest silenced all remaining drive to conserve his identity, silenced all upper-level thinking as a whole, and left him with the simple truth of what was unfolding before him. There was a dangerous enemy who was attacking a child in cold blood. He just moved. One for all roared to life, the cold in his chest snapped outwards, and he stepped between the so-called hero and Daichi. Without calling up even an ounce of the wind pressure he knew he could use to render Rain's quirk completely unusable and trust him, he'd come up with more than one way to make the man powerless during his time in Hada. The young hero's hand snapped across the man's wrist, completely shattered the technique and stopping him in his tracks, forcing him to look at Izuku, to focus on Izuku. And completely forget about the cat-eared child in front of him. "He's just a child, and yet you were. How dare you call yourself a hero? You're no hero," Izuku whispered low and dangerous, eyes drowning in shadows as he spoke. "He's no hero. Rain." He spoke calmly, too calmly. "You don't know me, and I don't know you, not that I'd ever care to, but I'm going to need you to listen to me very, very carefully, alright?" One for all howled, receding a bit as its usual brilliant bolts of energy were reduced to a light glow that emanated from its user's hair and skin, cloaking him in a heavy light which spoke of the strength which was pleading to be released. "Here's what's going to happen. We're going to walk away. You think you're walking away from this kid? One for all overflowed with a screech, lightning howling, and Izuku squeezed, satisfied to hear the man's wrist crack beneath his grip. The cold was singing about how this was right, how this was justice for all those people he'd wronged, and even more so for wronging him, and that he should keep going. He didn't, even if he really kind of wanted to. Instead, he spoke as the man cried out, trying fruitlessly to pull his hand away. "Don't interrupt me." His voice was harsh and promised something if he wasn't obeyed. Months of frustration and anger at this man were leaking out now, and Deku could barely curb the violent urges which were flowing upwards from his heart. This man had been about to harm a child, Daichi, no less, and in that single moment, the time traveler's heroic spirit registered the situation, registering Rain, not as a hero, but as a villain. His legs had moved, everything else forgotten, as his most base instincts had kicked in, and he'd reacted to the perceived situation. After all, in a situation where a villain is attacking someone, the last thing Izuku was going to do was just sit there. "Now, we're going to walk away and forget everything that happened here, okay? You're going to turn around and walk away from this. You're going to think about what happened here, really think about it, and then forget about this child, and about me." He was whispering now, so just the hero could hear him as he leaned a bit closer to allow the man better access to his wrathful Viridian eyes. Eyes which spoke without words a message that couldn't have been clearer to the career hero. "I don't care who you are, but you are beneath me, and you will listen. Fear the anger of the good shepherd who watches over his flock with a keen eye and will let neither lion nor thief approach his herd, for he will bring both sword and sling against any and all who might come to harm the lambs that rest beneath the shadow of his wings. No matter who they were. Or else." He gave one more squeeze to the man's already broken arm, and Rain whimpered as he fought to keep from shedding tears at the pain. He was really and truly afraid now, fear gripping him as it invoked understanding. Izuku's blood sang, and the emerald lightning snapped around them, a choir of joy and judgment as it hummed about the light it would bring to the evil before it, completely unable to recognize any difference between the ones it had been brought to bear against before and this man here, and forced the pro to his knees under. It's the weight of its sovereignty. Those few who remained on the streets after the sun dropped below the horizon and the city fell into darkness watched in frozen awe at what was happening before them. No more than a couple moments had passed, not even a minute, and yet there was so much heaviness to the situation they'd found themselves with a blessing to look upon. Rain was hated by all of Hada, both criminal or law-abiding citizens alike. A point of intersecting hatred between all who called the Shadow Town home, however, whether through apathy or fear, the man had long been left alone. The people knew that his fellow heroes would do nothing about his actions, and that should they speak up, they would likely find themselves in an unfavorable situation, so they stayed quiet. And now, a man nay, a hero, a true hero had appeared from their midst, cloaked in a power which sang like the horns of the gods, and had crumpled the town's tormentor to his knees in less than a moment. Who'd with a single hand done what many had tried to do with all the strength they could muster. Knock the man down a peg. Humble him. Make him fear like they had feared for so long. And so, as the people gathered, one becoming two, and two becoming four, and four becoming eight, they watched the emerald-wreathed man whose face they could not see with a reverence fit for a king, and spoke in hushed whispers to one another about answered prayers, and warriors sent from heaven, and about the phantom who might just be standing before them. Pulling up his hood without looking backwards towards the crowd, Izuku spoke, still hushed, as his anxiety at having a forming crowd behind him bubbled in his heart, and he knew it was time to end this. Okay. Then, he let go, and watched, as the older man stumbled backwards. Rubbing at his wrist, he stared at Izuku, as his half-formed sputters became cohesive enough to form words. "Who are you?" he asked, nearly silent, and with the eyes of a man who knew he was far outmatched. Izuku didn't answer him with his words, but instead chose a different kind of response. You see, having regained his higher thinking, and realizing how fucked he was if he didn't get Rain to think he was someone he shouldn't mess with, or even think about messing with, once he was away, and the fear had worn off, Izuku made his choice. Choosing from one of the many different ideas that instantaneously flashed through his head in reaction to the current situation, and one which he knew to be one of his greatest, most terrifying bluffs of all. Both to the person he used it on, and himself. Because really, if he messed up, and it got out that he had what he had, the number 2 hero would be gunning for his head. You see, it was common knowledge among those in the hero world that within the larger and more influential agencies of the Hero Association, there was a common practice to send sidekicks out into the field with a form of identification that was unique to that specific agency. This was so that heroes were more easily identifiable to the police or those who were out in the field with them, and to add an extra layer of protection to said agency in defense against spies and villains with quirks that allowed for easy infiltration, like Toga Himiko, or Twice. These were what was known as hero badges, and protocol dictated that should a hero be within an agency that required such forms of identification, they should carry them at all times, otherwise, they might be mistaken for a spy. They were one of the hero world's better kept secrets, as the point of the little pins was for the enemy, and thus the general public, to not know about them, making infiltration infinitely harder. Endeavor's agency happened to require such things. And so, Izuku reached into his pocket, retrieving both his provisional license and his Endeavor Agency hero badge, and flashed them together, so only Rain could see. He watched the man's eyes widen as he took in the little flame-shaped insignia that was no larger than a button, and met Izuku's face with a different kind of fear in his eyes. Funny thing about hero licenses, too. Unless you actually look closely, you can't tell the difference between a provisional license and a full one. I think he slipped both items back into his pocket, but we have come to an understanding. No. I'm here because of a mission my boss gave me to hunt down some big shot villain, and I would hate to have to report you, you know. It would take up too much of my time, and he would be upset if something took up too much of my time. I don't want that, and you don't want that, so it's just illogical for the both of us. Cocking his head and looking down on him, he gave the bastard a small, venomous grin. So, are we good? The man swallowed heavily, and Izuku ignored the sweat that was running down his neck in his own fear. He was playing the tough guy act hard, and it seemed to be working. Mr. Aizawa, the person the fake pro hero was channeling the hardest at the moment, seemed to have that kind of effect on people, and in combination with a little bit of Hawk's pride and some Endeavor level threats. His bluff was becoming a terrifying shield. If he's really a part of Endeavor's agency, then I'm done for if he reports me. That's what he's thinking. Izuku smiled. He felt a little bit villainous, to be honest, but he knew that this was for the best, and he didn't really feel that bad. I need to try and make sure he's not gonna go snooping. If it gets out that I have an Endeavor agency pin, and that I'm actually not currently a part of said agency, that I'm not a part of anything, actually, because I don't exist officially beyond my fake papers, which would fall apart if I was investigated, then Endeavor will hunt me down himself. It would be a massive security breach after all, so. Reaching out with one hand, he offered it to Rain to shake. What do you say? Yeah, we're good. He took it with the hand Daichi had bloodied, and Izuku gave him a firm grip, ignoring how the cold told him to crush his appendage like a soda can for daring to even try, and lay a finger on the cat-eared child behind him. Sweet. Terrible trio is still out there, you know, so really, putting such a heavy hitter like yourself out of the game, because you had a long day, and were in a bad mood, would really be a waste for the both of us. Izuku smiled, but it was plastic and fake. Might as well sprinkle a little bit of praise on there, just to be sure. Yeah, you're right. Just had a long day. The man laughed awkwardly as he stepped away, cradling his hand as he did and obviously straining a bit through the pain. I promise not to make things hard for you. If you need any help with your case, just let me know. I work best alone. Deku bit out, still smiling that dangerous plastic smile. But thanks for the offer, Rain. Oh, and remember, Izuku raised a single finger to his lips as the injured man backed away, smiling through the hush-hush motion before dropping his hand and turning his back on the dark-skinned man, throwing him a wave over his shoulder in an obvious dismissal. See you around. He didn't need to watch him to know he'd scurried off like the rat he was. He looked down at Daichi and smiled. Really smiled, something soft and gentle and so full of relief at him being alright. Hey, you okay? He asked, squatting low to where the feline boy was still sitting on the ground, pupils slowly widening to become the less primal cat-like shape the young hero was more familiar with. Deku? The boy whispered, tears gathering in his eyes as his shock and adrenaline disappeared and he was left with whatever emotions remained. And Arata appeared beside him and Izuku stood, taking the boy's hand to pull him up with him and tugged his hood a little further over his face as the people who'd caught the interaction watched him curiously. I'm lucky it's past nightfall and everyone was clearing out as quickly as they could. In the end, it hadn't been more than a few who'd stopped to watch the altercation, but the young man knew that it was more than enough if even one of them had caught it, especially the initial few seconds or when he'd shown Rain his ids on camera. They could post it and he could see the manhunt declaration now. Oh god. What if this is what gets me? What if I blink out of existence now because of a single dumbus catching me on camera and it goes viral and then suddenly Tiny Me sees it or something and then boops, there goes Izuku and… Shaking his head, he took a deep breath and cut off the train of thought. Nothing he could do about it now anyway, so all he could do was move forward. Lord, my list of things to talk about with Roomy just keeps getting longer. AM thinks of me like a father, I talked to a future serial killer, I had a panic attack in front of the kids, and I fractured Rain's wrist and liked it. Jesus, that's not even thinking about one for all. Alright, let's go. He herded them a bit more harshly this time, pushing them back towards the direction of home and making sure to keep a hand on Daichi's shoulder as they moved, both to offer him the silent support and reassurance that yes, Izuku was right there and nothing, so long as the young hero could help it, would ever happen to him if Izuku was there and that yes. He would probably get scolded when they got home for running off. He felt like an older brother who'd had to go drag his little brother out of the pile of absolute shit he'd gotten himself into, which really wasn't so far off the mark when he thought about it. At least no one is following us. That's good, at least. Moving silently and with purpose, it wasn't long before the group finally made their way home. The snapping of the lock shut sounded like the gavel of a judge though, as Izuku sighed heavily as he turned to face the group. Daichi, you are an absolute fucking idiot. Arata snarled, and the cat-eared boy seemed to fold inward on himself. He was never this quiet, nor did he ever just sit there and take Arata's comments without a fight, not unless he felt like they were true. And if he does, that's not okay either. Arata. Izuku chimed in, catching the boy's downright furious heterochromatic gaze, one red eye and one green, as he turned to face the older teen in a huff. Izuku. Arata, please. Don't. He asked, and the boy looked like he just might explode before his gaze slipped back to the still motionless form of his brother and he seemed to understand. The rabbit-eared child took a deep breath, shook his head, and let out his rage in what might just have been the heaviest sigh Izuku had ever heard, like all the sarcastic biting comments the boy had thought up on the trip back home, which no doubt numbered in the triple digits, exited his body in the form of that one gut-wrenching moan. Okay. But I'm telling Roomy when she gets home, so he's not getting away that easily. I had no intention of making sure he did. Good. He spat, but Izuku knew he was only so upset because his twin could have been very seriously hurt had the green-eyed hero not been there. Turning, he stormed into the bedroom and slammed the door shut. AM looked at the door, then at Izuku, and then at Daichi, before returning to the door. Weighing her options, she seemed to make her decision. I'm going to talk with him, she said as she moved towards the bedroom, speaking with all the resolve a 7-year-old could muster, and snuck inside the dark room with the softness of a spirit. With her gone, the two green-eyed teens were left alone. I'm Daichi muttered, and the black-haired teen hadn't been able to catch all of what he'd said. What was that? Izuku asked, gentle and genuinely curious. I'm sorry. Oh Daichi. The time traveler shook his head and sat down next to him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders as angry tears fell from the boy's eyes. It's my fault. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, the boy was hissing at himself now, quietly berating himself more than he was talking to Izuku, and the older boy wasn't going to have it. Hey. Look at me. Daichi, look at me. He was on the ground now, kneeling in front of the boy as their green eyes met and he made sure he was really seeing him and not just looking at him. Daichi, it's okay. You're okay. Everything is okay now. I promise. The quiet angry tears kept coming, but something seemed to give and the boy slowly wrapped his arms around Izuku for comfort and the older teen smiled. Then the door opened. I'm home, you bunch of. Roomy stopped cold in her tracks, something terrifying lighting up in her eyes as she took in the scene before her. What happened? This is going to be a long night. Izuku didn't drink by himself often, but today had been the longest of days, and Roomy had asked him for some time to talk to Daichi alone, so here he was, on the roof after covertly sneaking a bottle of sake from the stash which was hidden away in him and Roomy's shared closet and casually sipping on his drink. As he watched the stars from where he sat with his back pressed against the cold brick wall. We're going to need to find a new spot. It's getting too cold to just be sitting out here. Winter's coming. The warmth of the summer was descending into the cold of winter, and somehow through the poetic words of his alcohol-fueled mind Izuku felt like there hadn't been a thing more fitting in all his life. I told myself I wasn't like Stain. That's what I told myself. But I liked it. I hate Rain so much, and I really would have broken him. Right then and there, I didn't care if I became a villain in the eyes of everyone else if it meant protecting Daichi. I would have done it, would have crippled him or something, and I wouldn't have even had to convince myself. It would have been an easy choice to make if he tried to fight me, if he'd actually hurt Daichi. It scared him. All of it. The broken world, the questions, the answers, and all the in-between of this life that was becoming darker and colder by the second. Winter was coming indeed. Taking another drink of his sake, Izuku sighed, reaching up towards the starry sky and letting himself just sit in the silence of the cold autumn night. The humming sounds of the city came together with the quiet of the wind and he just couldn't help but feel a bit comfortable with the numbing feeling in his heart. It was better than feeling the cold after all. What am I going to do? He muttered, not expecting anyone to answer. And then someone did. Well, you can start by taking a breath, calming down, and passing me the other glass. Roomy's voice cut through the air, and her sudden presence next to him was able to warm the numbness into feeling. Was I thinking out loud again? When are you not? Correction, she raised a hand, closing her eyes a bit theatrically as he passed her one of their sake glasses and poured her a drink. When are you not, whenever you're stressed out? They both shared a laugh, and she found a comfortable spot beside him as she put the glass to her lips and sighed contentedly. Look at you, what a rebel. Taking the sake up here all on your own. She gave him a teasing side eye as Izuku felt heat rise to his face, his lips pulling up into an awkward "you caught me" smile. I remember having to convince you to even let me drink that first night. You remember that? He chuffed. How could I forget? He shook his head, a smile grazing his features as he knocked back his glass and stretched out his hand for his rabbit-eared friend to pour him another. She did, and he shot his own look her way. But what can I say? I have this cute friend of mine who's just a terrible influence. Oh my fucking, did I actually just say that? Roomy smiled and laughed. Is that so? Well, I have to tell you, Izuku, because I care about you, that you should stop hanging out with idiots like that. You'll jeopardize your future if you spend too much time with delinquents, broccoli brain. She nudged his shoulder with her own and he grinned from ear to ear. What can I say? I just don't think I could say goodbye. No. And that doesn't have anything to do with the fact that this cute friend of yours pays the rent, right? Definitely not. Of course, she giggled, what the hell, before sighing and relaxing against the wall, perhaps a little bit closer than she had been before. I get where you're coming from though. I'm kinda friends with this handsome hero who's technically a vigilante and who tries to pretend he's not all that, but then he walks out into the middle of the kitchen without a shirt and I just kinda get the feeling that he's showing off. What the fuck? What the fuck? Is this flirting? I am not at all prepared for this. No one's ever taught me how to flirt. How do I flirt? Is this even flirting? I'm so confused. I mean, it kinda sounds like it, but I am not prepared for this. Say, cooling his inner panic, Izuku merely smiled and sipped his glass, staring up at the starry night sky as he nudged the rabbit-eared girl with his own shoulder and they descended into a comfortable silence. Jesus, Deku, Roomy said after a couple minutes and another glass of rice wine. What happened today? Sighing, the time traveler almost laughed at the question. Correction. He smiled, something bitter. What the fuck was even today? That's bad, huh? You literally don't even know half of it, Roomy. Daichi and Rain were just the icing on the cake. Today was a shit show to end all shit shows. He fell quiet again after that and felt angry, frustrated tears begin building painfully in his throat as he shook his head. His lip quivered a bit and the cold threatened to overtake him. And then it didn't. Because Roomy, his pillar, his support, was there. Shifting her hand ever so slightly from where she was next to him, she laced her fingers through his and squeezed gently firmly as a warmth flooded the young man's chest, and he breathed. Her eyes said all the things that her words didn't. An unspoken everything, a silent warmth, and a promise to, at the very least, sit there and listen to what he had to say. To not judge and to stand with him through it. The message was clear to Izuku's heart and he couldn't help crying because of it. Because of the silent words that were poured into him, into the ears of his soul, even if his physical ears heard nothing but the thrumming song of the city around them. I'm here. I'm going to listen. I'm not going to abandon you. Lean on me. No matter what. The time traveler shook his head, trying to cut off the frustrated tears which were rolling down his cheeks now, and rubbing at his face with his free hand, the one which wasn't entangled with Roomy's, and hiccuped heavily. Shaking his head, he took deep breaths to help calm himself down, and heard his friend sigh heavily beside him. Oh, Izuku. He smiled through the pain, biting his lip as he choked back his sobs, and just kinda went with it. Let everything pour out, starting with the very first thing that came to mind. I'm a terrible person, Roomy. Fucking hell, I'm a villain, aren't I? I am. She squeezed his hand, and he quieted up, at least, as much as his weeping would allow. No, you're not, so don't even try and start with that bullshit, Deku. She said it like it was the most simple thing in the world, and it made the young man's aching heart soften just a bit inside his chest. The sharp edges of his internal battle dulled at her words, and once again it became just a bit easier to breathe. Now let's start over, from zero, together, okay? What happened? He took a breath and tried again. Well, I talked with a future serial killer today. One I've fought before, or will fight. She sucked in a breath but nodded, pushing him to continue. And well, Izuku shook his head again. The cold in his chest ached at having to talk about this, but he knew it was for the best. Knew that if he could talk to anyone about it, it was Roomy, and that no matter what he said, she'd never just up and abandon him for it. He knew her. And that wasn't her. He said, well, I agree with him, but we're really similar, Roomy. Me and him. We're asking the exact same questions and looking for the exact same answers, and he was right. And where does that leave me? He's killed so many people, and his words were a jumbled mess of syllables and half-formed murmurs, and yet his companion seemed to understand anyway. Another squeeze, and he fell silent. Izuku, I don't know this random fucker. The way she said it was solid, strong, and sounded like she was talking about something incredibly obvious, because she was. She'd never met Stain before, after all. But I do know you. You're a hero, Izuku, and whatever this guy said is wrong. You're nothing alike. Roomy, I broke Rain's wrist today, and I loved it. I felt good. He almost choked on the word, coughing it out like poison on his tongue. I wanted to keep going. Wanted to make him feel all the pain that he'd forced on all those he'd brutalized. I was almost praying that he'd do something to pick a fight with me, give me some reason to tear him apart, because I really wanted to break him. I wouldn't have held back, Roomy. I would have snapped him in half and smiled while I did it. I hate him. But you didn't, for one. You didn't do any of those things. And for two, that's not wrong, Izuku. Your feelings, your emotions, they're not wrong. She scooted closer to him now and lifted up their hands so that their thighs could press together. You're human. It's okay to feel hate and all those dark, terrible things I know you feel guilty for feeling, and to be honest, if what Daichi said was right, then you saved him. Izuku, you saved my little brother. Damn it, I'm crying again. Things were quiet for a moment as Izuku let what she'd said sink in before speaking again. They called him the hero killer. He murdered fake heroes just like Rain and crippled so many others, all because he wanted to purge society of all those he deemed unworthy to call themselves heroes. Izuku felt the words come rolling out before he could stop them and promptly bit his tongue. Looking away, he felt a deep frown pull across his features. And I shouldn't have said that, but it's true. And Roomy, I saw into his heart. I know what he said was the truth. Everything we've talked about here on this roof and all the things we've noticed about this fucked up system, he gestured around them, this broken world. He sees it too, and me and him are both on the edge of something. Roomy, I can't just sit here and do nothing about this brokenness, I have to. You have to fix it, huh? She asked, and there was something sharp in her voice now. Someone has to. I can't just sit here and do nothing about this shithole of a world we live in. Well, I'm Izuku Midoriya, because I have some fucking facts for you to chew on before you get all idealistic on me. She turned to face him and grabbed his jaw so he would have to look her in the eyes. They were barely a couple inches away now, and the young man could feel the breath of her words on his lips as she spoke. The heat in her voice as it rose from her belly and spread across his face. The world has been broken for fucking ever, and as long as people are still people, it always will be. Nothing, not one fucking thing, you do can change that fact, and it's pure arrogance to think otherwise. You're not God, Izuku. You're just a man. Just another broken human, just like the rest of us. She smiled gently now. So before you go all save your complex on me, make sure you remember that. You're just a man. Something clicked into place, just like it had earlier with Stain, but it still wasn't a full picture. A blurry outline for something that was brewing in the depths of his soul, perhaps, but not anywhere close to a final product. He nodded, because what she'd said had felt true. It felt right. In the same way he knew and accepted that some of what Stain had said, what he'd spoken on, had been true, so was what Roomy had just told him. He just didn't know what that meant or where everything fit together. Okay then what? Roomy prompted. Suddenly, even if the previous conversation held a lot more significance, Izuku felt a lot more embarrassed about this one. Smiling awkwardly, he reclaimed the glass of alcohol which he'd forgotten on his other side and took a long drink, slipping the rest of the serving past his lips and wincing for a moment at the taste before gathering his courage and pushing onwards. Well, AM sees us like her parents, apparently. He watched as said little girl's sister froze, but he pushed on anyway, even through the bit of awkward air that was now present between them. Because they were both suddenly very aware of how little space there was between them. She told us all when we went to get Raymond and almost had a breakdown. Oh, also, I had a panic attack in front of the kids after talking with the serial killer guy. He added, almost as a side note, as he waited for the hero in training to process everything he just word vomited. Well fuck. Yup. Izuku popped the pea and shook his head, a bitter yet playful smile returning to his features, as though he really was surprised at how crazy that day had been. Shitshow to end all shitshows. What do we do? And so he waited, simply allowing himself to become anchored in now through he and Roomy's synchronized pulses and the warmth of her hand and the sensation of his own breathing. Eventually, she spoke. I don't think there's a lot we can do about this. She sighed. I mean, I just told you right. Kind of. Someone's feelings aren't wrong, and if that's how she feels, then there isn't a lot we can do to change that. We're just going to have to go about it like we do everything else. With no plan whatsoever and a full send mentality. He asked, a light tease to his voice that had the girl thumping him in the side as he chuckled. No. We play the field. We go with whatever happens, but we're on defense. She downed her cup of rice wine and Izuku poured her another, noting how they'd almost finished off the bottle. We just have to go with the flow. If a problem comes up, we'll deal with it, but we'll only create more problems if we try to fix things that don't need fixing. If AM wants to see us like that, it's her choice and has very little, if anything at all, to do with us. But what happens when I leave is unsaid, and yet, as always, it is heard. Still not God Deku. We can't save everyone from heartache. It's part of being human. He hated that he couldn't and that he knew she was right, so he nodded and swayed to the beat of some unheard song, thoughtlessly rubbing his thumb up and down her own in his turmoil. Oh, and don't worry about the panic attack thing. I'm sure if I know the brats like I do, and I do that they don't hold it against you, you perfectionist idiot. She shrugged, and he knew she was right. With every one of her simple statements, it seemed as though a great many of his worries were being washed away like campfires in a hurricane. The smaller ones, at least. Oh, and I've decided on something. Roomy added, and Izuku felt himself tense up. Is she finally going to ask about One for All? The floating thing. What am I going to say? Should I just tell her? I'm not gonna push you on the floating thing. You've never kept anything from me before, so if you are hiding something, which I know you are, fucker, then I know it must be for a good reason. Okay. So no need to tell me if you don't want to. I'm not going to force or pressure you into something you're not comfortable with, got the Deku. Is she just going to let it go? He nodded numbly and, as if sensing his confusion, she pushed on. What I mean is I trust you, idiot. So I'll wait until you're ready to tell me whatever it is that you're hiding. She smiled, looking up at the stars as the sake painted a faint blush across her cheeks, and she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. Had Izuku not been so tipsy from their late night drink and so emotionally drained from the past day, he might have found the energy to freak out over her close proximity, but then again. This is us. This is how we are. There's nothing really complicated about it. And that, at least, was a truth he could get behind. Izuku had never had a girlfriend before and he still never had, but he imagined that such a relationship must feel pretty similar to what he and Roomy shared. Not that we're dating, because we're not. Which wasn't to say that somewhere in his heart, Izuku didn't wish that maybe they one day would. I guess we're simple. And so, with sake blurring their thoughts, as they drifted off into the spirit of the night, simply sitting with one another and enjoying each other's company and warmth, they both hummed little songs and sweet nothings to each other as they sat and became content in just being. They spoke some moments and were silent in others, and in the silence and the sound, they were always just there, with each other, in the dead of night, as the stars shone down upon them, and they contemplated everything and nothing all at once. That's we're simple. Thanks for watching my video, and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, link is in the description. See you next time, till then sayonara.